So vibe coding is this thing that has come onto the scene with the rise of LLMs in the last few years, and I actually think it has killed traditional software engineering, and I want to explain why. And the first way that I think it's killed traditional software engineering is basically that the moat that software engineers used to have around the field has largely disappeared, or at the very least, it's become like a very shallow puddle, if you can call it that, or divot. And the reason for this is because what you used to have to do, I think, to be a software engineer was wildly different than the things that you could need to do to masquerade as a software engineer today. You used to have to go to college, or even before that, I think you used to have to be wildly, interested in software engineering and computers to really understand what was happening inside of a machine. And now it's very different. You don't need to know pretty much anything to be able to spin up a web application, to build out an API endpoint, or to sort of serve traffic on the internet. Things have just become very commoditized. And so with this rise of vibe coding, you don't really need to have the skills to know how to do the stuff that you need to do as a software engineer. It's more that you need to understand how to wield the tools to have or then temporarily possess those skills to be a software engineer. And that's just very strange to me. It's really evolved extremely quickly. And I'm sure that maybe people said the same thing when things like Google came out. But this still feels very different to me because it's sort of like it just gives you this massive power to all of a sudden shapeshift and become someone maybe who doesn't actually have the skills. And now all of a sudden you do. So I think there's really no barrier anymore. You don't have to go to college. You don't have to go to a boot camp. You just have to have sort of like this $19.99 subscription per month that sort of lets you have these skills that you are sort of borrowing, if that makes sense. It's almost like you're renting the skills of being a software engineer. And I think the next reason that sort of traditional software engineering is dead or has been killed by vibe coding is just because software has largely become a solved game. And the best comparison I can make is something like checkers, right? Before you play, or excuse me, tic-tac-toe, right? Let's make it even simpler. Like tic-tac-toe is a game that before you even start playing, you can know that you can at least guarantee a tie. And I think software has become a similar thing where it's just this solved game. If you actually think about software, I think the most difficult times in software was like very early on, and then probably in the early 2000s when like these very large companies like Google or Meta or Twitter or all these like big behemoths now had to scale, and they had to figure out how to scale because no one had really had to deal with that problem before. All of a sudden you had tons and tons of people coming online, you had the rise of smartphones, and now it was like every single person on the planet Earth was like connected to this thing called the internet and used software almost daily. And so, Google has a handful of products that serve literally billions of people every single day. And that was a huge problem to try to figure out and to solve. But now I think that a lot of those like harder, more difficult problems have been solved. And the reality is that while those problems, those really large scale, difficult, high throughput, niche problems apply to very few companies like the Google, Netflix, Amazon, Meta, Apple, etc., it doesn't really matter at all for 99.9% of companies. Most companies, all they're trying to do is to stay afloat and try to make money and try to find product market fit, right? They're not worried about all those different concerns that these really specific large tech companies are. And so the reality is that for the majority of those companies, those 99.9% of companies, what do you actually need to do? Well, you need someone who can, either know how to build out API endpoints and serve traffic, or can have a subscription, right, that can help you create a Stripe integration so that customers can pay you. But it's really not rocket science. You're not doing this crazy complicated thing. And I think that's just become more and more true as time has gone on, especially since vibe coding. Before it was like, okay, maybe integrating with Stripe was more nuanced and it was more difficult. But now you could actually just ask something to do it for you. And so you don't really need to go to a 4-year degree or go to a boot camp to be able to understand how to do that, or really to, I guess, get that working, right? And that is what 99.9% of companies need. They just need stuff working for the happy path for 1,000 customers, not for 1 billion customers. So that's also sort of how I feel like vibe coding has killed this field of traditional software engineering. And the more I think about it, the more it sort of, I guess, lends itself to other transitions that maybe other professions have seen. I always start thinking about like accountants, right? Accountants used to have to do very meticulous math and had to be very organized with bookkeeping and things. And now I think accountants, with the rise of something like Excel, it's really commoditized that profession. Now Excel actually allows you to very easily organize all your books. And so I now think that accountants have more become people who interpret and visualize data and understand trends in business data. as opposed to like adding these numbers to get the P&L sheet of a company. Although that's still very important, I think Excel really does the heavy lifting here the same way that these large LLMs help and do the heavy lifting for the majority of software engineers. So I think that the field of software engineering is going to evolve in this fashion, where maybe doing the work isn't necessarily the hard thing, or building out the initial structure for a web app or for a company to have an MVP isn't going to be really what's hard anymore. It's going to be more about like getting from not from 0 to 1 anymore, but from 1 to wherever the company may move. And it just reminds me a lot of like how accountants, I guess, maybe started leveraging something like Excel, and inevitably their jobs changed because of it. And this actually worries me a lot. It worries me because I think people who are more junior now, again, are going to be using these things and leveraging these tools without really having a solid foundation to stand on. And it's not to say that every single junior is going to be like this. I just think it's way harder when it feels like you always have this easy out for this thing, this black box, to give you answers and to do stuff for you, instead of just convincing yourself really that you should do the hard work and sit down and learn this thing the old-fashioned way, so to speak. So it feels like now you just get spoon-fed, really, like a lot of this information. And if you haven't already been feeding yourself consistently, constantly for a long time, I just feel worried that people aren't going to know how to fend for themselves. And I think if those juniors become senior, I don't really know what the next juniors are going to look like. And that might be a ridiculous statement, but that's, again, just sort of how I feel right now, where vibe coding has become this amorphous thing that seemingly has taken the entire industry by storm, and everybody's using it. And so I just think if you don't really have to cram stuff into your brain repeatedly in a way that's difficult or hard to learn, I wonder how much it will really stick. Like for me, the hardest things that I've learned, or the things that have stuck with me most rather, are the things that I really had to work super hard to get into my brain. And I just think you don't really have to do that a lot now for traditional software engineering, for doing the simple stuff that a lot of these companies will require. So I think that the value sort of is going to shift in what makes a good software engineer. I think that really being able to build something and getting something working is going to become sort of like pass and go. Like that is the default thing that you should be able to do. It's sort of like par on a golf course. It's what you should be able to reach and to aim for, although I've never really been able to do that on a golf course, but you get the point. I think the value is going to shift from someone who can make something work given enough time to someone who can easily get something working that's probably simple enough for most companies. And then it's like they can do something else on top of that. Because the reality is that now I think companies aren't struggling with building things with these tools. It's almost like construction. Like, how hard is it really to move a bunch of dirt around if you have all this heavy machinery? Well, it's actually not that difficult, but like maybe correctly building a foundation of a building, maybe that is difficult. Again, I don't really know how construction works exactly, but I think you get the idea. So I think it's really going to move more from people who can build stuff to people who can build stuff that people want and then market it in a way that people actually want to give you money for that thing. I think what used to be hard is getting up and running. It used to be getting the software out there into the world. And now that I think building has largely become commoditized by these LLMs and vibe coding, I think it's going to be a lot more about, well, what can you do once the thing is built? How can you get it to a million different people? How can you get people to take out their credit card and actually give you money to do that thing or to pay for that service? So I think the scope of what a traditional software engineer is going to change the same way that I think the scope or what encompasses an accountant, for example, or a mathematician after a calculator has come out is going to sort of redefine how software engineers are viewed and what they're expected to do. And especially in this age where all these tools are super available to everybody and they're very, very powerful, at least, considering what it used to take to do a lot of these different things, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the landscape of software engineering evolves and how it changes, and just what people are going to expect of someone who is a software engineer. I think it's going to be very different, and I think it's going to move into more of like people skills. And again, not just being able to build something, but to probably be able to scale and to get it into people's hands and to get them to give you money. So I don't know. I think vibe coding is a very weird thing that has happened to the industry. I don't really know if it's going to be good or bad for software engineers long term, although everybody seems to be using it today. But yeah, that's just my 2 cents. Let me know what you guys think in the comments.